My name is Graham Reynolds. I'm an instructor here in the history department. I also work on the history of the book, so I'm very much looking forward to the talk Dr. Devin Fitzgerald will give us today. Dr. Fitzgerald is a scholar of global book cultures and intercultural encounters. He received his PhD in history in East Asian languages from Harvard University in 2020. He went on to become the curator of rare books and the history of printing at the UCLA Library Special Collections. He's at present a lecturer in the Department of History and an associate research fellow at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. He's also a member of, and at present, the vice president of the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, and he has taught courses at both the University of Virginia Rare Book School and the California Rare Book School. Some of his publications include The Early Modern Information Revolution, co-authored with Anne Blair, found in the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern European History, Chinese Papers in the Early and Modern World in Ars Orientalis, and Manchu Language Pedagogical Practices, The Connections Between Manuscript and Printed Books, published in Saksaha. Today, he is here to give us a talk with the tempting title, East Asian and Western Pre-Modern Books Reconsidered, the concept of edition and the importance of comparative bibliography. This event is co-sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage at the Rare Book School, the University of Chicago Library, and the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago, with support from the Title VI National Resource Center grant from the U.S. Department of Education. Please forgive my slip there. I think we're in for a real treat, as few scholars are as well versed in the history of the book, both East and West, as Dr. Fitzgerald. So without further ado, I will turn the mic over to him.
Great. Thanks so much, Graham. And I think it's actually appropriate to confuse a 6 and a 9 early on, because it's a common typographical error amongst early modern printers in Europe. So thank you guys so much today for coming out to hear this discussion of the problems of the concept of edition. Now, one of the pitfalls of studying the Chinese book in a Western context is rooted in our alienation from actors' categories. East Asianists writing in English often use bibliographical terminology from other fields, and the analogies we use and choose allow for slippages. Often the words we use are more similar than different, but often they hide aspects of the materiality of the books. Chinese books, their codex form, their paper pages, their paratextual features often appear to be very similar to early European books. And the sum of our sinological borrowings distances us from Chinese printed books and the best ways to describe them. One borrowing I think that we need to pay attention to is the concept of edition and its implications for the study of the history of the book. Now, over the last decade or so, Anglophone book history, like so many other historical disciplines, has had its transnational and global turns. One need not look far to see examples of this, as in this edited collection, the book A Global History, by edited by Michael Suarez and J.H.R. Woodhusen. Now, this collection has been much criticized because it's global book history from an English perspective. However, I'm more inclined to celebrate any attempt to make our understanding of the material text more capacious. But while we're at this moment of expansion doing global and comparative book histories, we need to consider how the field of book history writ large, should address the demands of a broader perspective. One thing that has made book history so compelling is its explicit methodological commitment to the physical material text. And this book history has been fortunate to be in dialogue with its mature sibling discipline, bibliography. Book history is effective because it draws on bibliographical tools to make arguments that give us insight into different historical subdisciplines. Book history is a sort of intellectual history with a dash of bibliography, a sort of economic history with the same zest. If we do not have the work of bibliography or codicology to help us approach bibliographical objects, it's unclear how our work on the material text would proceed. And as an example, there is already a comparative global codicology as a discipline that's developing. Now, one thing about bibliography that helps us clarify is that it's a precise term-oriented field. So today, with the example of edition in mind, we're going to travel through the European textual bibliographical tradition and consider how scholars of European textual history approach the concept of edition. Then we'll enter into dialogue with Chinese scholars working on the Chinese concept of edition, which is really a constellation of several related concepts. And then finally, we'll talk about the conclusions. What happens when we have bad analogies? What happens when we translate the term edition from an Anglo-European tradition into Chinese book history? And what are its implications for the field? Now, in the discipline now widely considered descriptive bibliography, the study of editions reigns supreme. Tracking, and this is an example of two separate editions, the same text, but obviously printed at different moments in times. One is a folio, one is an octavo, and those are technical terms we can unpack later if you're masochistic enough. But these are two editions, so it's the same exact text, Martin and Martini's Conquest of China, in two different forms. And that's what allows Western bibliographers to understand their objects they're studying. Now, the idea of edition in the modern academic sense really has its roots in Henry Bradshaw's earliest dated attempts to collate books through the production of something called a collational formula in 1861. And this launched the beginnings of the technical evolution of a field for the study of books in bibliography. The idea of edition has, of course, evolved in the interceding years. In the early 20th century, literary studies and the search for firsts led to bibliographers to begin attempting to sort the relationship between copies of the same text, so two things that were recognized as the same edition, and trying to assign priority, which is the best printer's copy. But more or less now, everyone in the field operates with a standard definition. And this definition, in its sort of classical declaration, is from Philip Gaskell, a scholar active in the 60s and 70s in the UK. And in his standard work for the field of Western bibliography, he argued that the concept of edition means books printed by substantially the same setting of type. And then he went on to later note that we may take it as a simple rule of thumb that there has been a new edition when more than half the type has been reset. So if it's 51% one setting of type, it's the same edition as a book that shares that setting. Now, to give you a sense of how this works, I think it's useful to consider the work of a Western printing shop, in which basically every book would arrive as a manuscript, and a figure like this editor would take the printed manuscript and do a process called casting off. So he'd read the manuscript, making ticks on the side of the page, which denoted how the type was to be set. Then it would go to this figure here, the compositor, who would set the type according to the cast-off notes of the copy editor. The type, after being set, would be put to form. So here we have standing type imposed as a quarto. So see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 pages, which would be a sheet of paper folded like this, gives us a quarto, which then would be moved to press. And then after the printing of, say, 500 sheets of that same setting of type was made, the type would then be redistributed back into the cases. So that's basically how Western book printing works. It's this constant to and fro motion between the compositor setting type, the type moving to press, the press being redistributed. So pre-modern Western books are acts in time. They're labor that occurs at a specific moment in time, never to be identically reconstructed ever again. Now, the reason for examining multiple copies of an edition is because lots of things happened to books as they were being set and put through the press. Printers could make corrections. They could change settings of type after 100 pages had been printed to make a correction to have a typographical error. And so for bibliographers, what we're really looking for is something called an ideal copy. Now, this is not an imagined version of a text. Rather, the ideal copy of a book should be understood as a product of bibliographical work, which provides a standard description against which individual copies of a text can be measured. Fredson Bowers describes the process of arriving at the ideal copy as, quite simply, examining every available copy of an edition of a book to distinguish between its variants. And as Sarah Werner has noted, the basis for a catalog record is usually the ideal copy of the book. That is, this imagined book as most perfect and complete. One way of thinking about this is the final version of an edition. It has all its leaves, all its cancels, all its places. The ideal copy is the source of basic information of the book. So bibliographers designed this system of tracking editions in order to create ideal copies to create bibliographical standards. Now, to create a description of an ideal copy, bibliographers have two related concepts that they rely on. Below the level of edition, all Western books have both an issue and a state. Now, there were many reasons for variations in issue and state, and this is what Western bibliography is uniquely good at tracking. So, for example, when type was, once printing was done, sometimes the type was not redistributed. It was left standing, meaning that it could be wrapped with a cord and set aside for later use. Sometimes printed sheets from an earlier setting of type ended up with new sheets from that standing type used much later after it was corrected. And so once this process occurs over time, it introduces variation in issue and states. So issue, and we won't talk about that very much today, but an issue of a book is part of an edition, but it's tied much more closely to the intentions of a printer. What this would mean is that issue is the same edition of a book if it's 51% or more of the same type, and then identified as a consciously planned, printed, and marketed unit. So in the case of this book we see here on the screen, The Triumph of Peace, you see this is the third impression, which for a long time people thought meant third edition, but this is in some ways a new issue because the printer just switched out the title page for marketing purposes. So it's still the same edition of the book, but we'll talk about later also why that's not true. The most important thing that bibliographers do is track state. Now, tracing the state of a book is where things get more complicated. The work of Western bibliography for the hand-press period consists really of discovering different states of texts. Difficult to discover stop press corrections. This is when the press is paused and a correction is made on the bed of the press to the type once a typographical error has been discovered. So you can find stop press corrections, cancels, meaning an individual leaf is removed and replaced with a corrected leaf, as well as different settings for individual gatherings. Sometimes the type will fall apart and have to be reset. And tracking that work is what we refer as variations in state. In his famous work, Printers of the Mind, D.F. Mackenzie described how the records of the Cambridge University Press vividly illustrate the complicated working styles of pre-modern pressmen. Most presses printed multiple projects at once. The type could be poached from one project to another, only to be recomposed later. Work stretched over months and years, as big projects were delayed for smaller job projects. It's no wonder then that printed books were, as Adrian Johns has argued, prone to being inconsistent and treated as objects of skepticism by pre-modern readers. And here you can see this, again, Philip Gaskell definition of state is really useful for understanding all of the sorts of variation Western bibliographers are looking for in their books. And I think as East Asianists, we should be looking for much more than this, because our books are actually a lot harder to deal with in many ways we'll talk about later. So, these alterations affecting makeup of pages, deletions, substitution, alterations made after some copies have been sold, so they'll add in appendixes, they'll reset whole sections of the book, special paper copies. All of these things are things that Western bibliographers are making note of. And this all feeds into their concept of what the edition of a book is, so that they can produce an understanding of the ideal copy. Now, of course, nothing is ever easy. And back to this book I talked about as a new issue, the Triumph of Peace is an especially nightmarish example of how tracking editions can occur. Stephen Tabor, who's responsible for this quote, has demonstrated both the determination and masochism needed to track the complicated publication history of this work. So first published in 1634, The Triumph was a masque authored by William Sherman and performed for British royalty. It was such a success that it was performed multiple times, despite costing hundreds of pounds and consisting of a cast of over 100. The popularity, its very popularity, resulted in a bibliographical nightmare, as W. Greggs called it. Nightmare is rather an understatement, as Tabor has described. Everything I just defined for us, those terms, has to get thrown out the window. The normal hand-pressed taxonomy of edition, issue, and state is inadequate to sort copies into well-behaved impression, issue, and state. So there's no real good way for tracking this. Now, one reason for this is, as Tabor concluded, the only possible way to understand the printing history of the text was through page-by-page comparison of all individual copies. I think he looked at over 150 copies and compared them page by page, which you can do as a librarian, not so much if you're on the tenure track. So after a careful examination of existing copies of the text, Tabor demonstrated that the problem with Triumph is that about half the type for the text was left standing at all times through 4 different impressions. Now, the half that was left standing varied from impression to impression. And as it was left standing, the printer poached type as needed for other projects. So the type left standing had type taken out of it to print other projects. And so the first impressions and the last impressions thus are actually kind of part of the same edition, except not really, because there's no single copy that has sheets that match the sheets from another copy. So it's pure chaos, because this thing was printed for basically 2 years continuously in 4 impressions, with sheets mixed from first impression to fourth impression. They're all mixed in everywhere. Now, while typographical shenanigans such as those witnessed in the case of Triumph are generally rare, there's much more other common forms of mixing. In her description of Thomas Heywood's Londini Artium and Scientarium Scatorigo, J. Caitlin Finlayson conducted a thorough analysis of variance between the 2 existing copies of the text. So a totally different case. We just have 2 copies. A careful examination of corrections between the copies allowed for their chronological ordering. Parts of each gathering, and a gathering is this folded sheet. So parts of each gathering remain untouched between the 2 copies, but in other places, pages were substantially reset between the 2 copies. So in this case, we see that even between 2 copies, they're the same edition, but whole pages in form were reset. Now, I've given you some complicated examples, but despite the complications surrounding the idea of edition, this concept does important work for Western bibliographers. While the chaos I just described in the case of Triumph of Peace can inspire perhaps conclusions like Adrian John's about the instability of pre-modern printed works. The truth is far more nuanced. Continental printers rarely produce the sorts of chaos that English printers generated. Surveying Italian books at UCLA, bibliographers are desperate for some sort of hijinks. They're all really well made. There's nothing between copies that you can ever discover, really, that's particularly exciting. And in my dissertation research on editions of Martino Martini's De Bello Tartarico Historia, I despaired over the uniformity of copies and examined over 200 different copies of 30 editions and found absolutely nothing. There were no variations. They were well-made books. I spent a lot of time doing this thing that is an appendix that then I didn't feel like cleaning the data, and I removed it from my dissertation. So, you know, that's a bibliographer's work. And as Thomas Tansel has noted, the time when a book was printed changes the sorts of issues we're likely to encounter. The messiness of 18th century books is not like the messiness of earlier books. That said, because each edition is, no matter how complicated, a product of work that produced a discrete number of texts in a print run of some hundreds to around 1,000, and since type for every given book would be redistributed at some point, the pre-modern Western book is by its very nature rooted in quantitative information with definite temporal limits. We can hypothetically count the number of editions printed by a printer. We can also assume that the press work existed only for a moment in time. The type was a moment in time. After that, it proceeded to its next moment in time. Almost all big data-driven bibliography is intimately tied to this quantifiability. And here you can see this sort of quantifiability I really just found this today. I typed in editions quantity, and there's like 100 charts like this on the internet because that's how people study Western books. So even with lost titles, scholars of the pre-modern West can enumerate and calculate in ways that produce useful overviews of the history of the book. So that's the work, in some ways, of what edition does for Western bibliographers. It's a moment in time in printing houses that you can track. You can talk about the Plantin Press in Antwerp, know how many editions it printed. You can even speculate to how many individual copies were printed from those editions. It is a quantifiable, heavily capitalized industry for producing texts. So, as we say, now for something completely different. Now, the Chinese edition, and I have this fond memory of talking to Oki Yasushi and Peter Kornitzky in Tokyo in 2020 in February, so the last time I left the country before the pandemic. And we both made a joke about how wonderful it is being bibliographers because you never actually get to see the same book twice, because East Asian books are defined by their incredible variability. And to begin unpacking this variability and the idea of edition in a xylographical, and so we're talking about Chinese context, but actually I've been working on movable type printing in Japan and Korea lately, and I think a lot of these principles are actually going to translate over into movable type printing. Chinese bibliographers have approached the relationship of edition by considering the relationship between blocks and the books they print. It's a different evidence relationship. Unlike edition, issue, and state, there is not necessarily a hierarchical relationship between Chinese bibliographical concepts. Moreover, Chinese bibliographers are not in complete agreement about the terms for describing books. However, following both Li Zhiqing and Guo Lixuan, there are certain terms that tend to be used when describing a general approach to assessing copies. And so this is a list I've just landed on, culling from about 10 or 11 different Banbenshui books. And so these are, I think, generally standards, and I'm sure someone in Fudan would fight with me about this, but I'll save that fight for Shanghai if I ever go back. And these terms are early imprints, later imprints, original blocks, amended blocks, original engraving, and copied engraving. Now, when working with any xylographically printed books, almost all of these features need to be considered before we can determine the nature of the books in front of us. Now, it almost goes without saying, but xylographically printed books are difficult to date. If blocks are properly cared for, they could be used for generations. The difficulty with dating blocks has led Chinese bibliographers to develop the distinction between early imprints and late imprints. These concepts, as defined by Li Qingzhi, allowed scholars to track important changes in a text, and generally defined, we can think of early imprints as those imprints that are printed early, sometimes soon after the blocks were engraved, and late imprints as late. Sometimes, how do you demarcate between early and late? Vibes. Basically, it's the technical bibliographical term. You go by vibes. I mean, connoisseurship if we're being fancy, but I was in Los Angeles for a long time. Now, generally defined, so an example of early imprints late imprints is here in Sichuan. In 2019, I was at the Qingyangong, a Taoist temple, and they're running off imprints from their late Qing, early Republic Daozan. So the Taoist canon being printed today in Sichuan. So these are 110, 120-year-old blocks. A scary moment while I was in the room is a block dropped on the floor, shattered into pieces, and then they just picked it up, nailed it back together, and continued printing. So what are these editions? It's technically an 1880s edition, except printed in 2019. And once this paper ages, all of that bibliographical data will be lost, and we'll just be standing here with these books trying to figure out when they were printed. Now, the concept of early imprints is not entirely absent in our English language scholarship in the history of the book. Thomas Ebre's work on the long lives of the 10 Bamboo Studio pays particular attention to the organization and dating of nearly all extant copies of this book. Ebre's categorized copies of the manual according to edition, in this case meaning the set of wood blocks completed after the act of carving, and then what he calls superstates. So, right, this is him borrowing from Western bibliography, but also at the same time doing an early imprint, later imprint classification. Now, the first set of blocks were completed around 1631 for this book, and they were used for printing the manual through 1870. Here's a copy of the manual in UChicago's collections. You can look at it early and try and tell me if you think it's early or late imprint after this talk. So anyways, his description of the last printing of the text reads, and this is his bibliographical description, first edition, fourth superstate, many blocks are very worn, many blocks are missing, many blocks are newly cut. I also called this the 1879B edition to distinguish it from a different 1879 edition. So this clear separation from edition and superstate seen in Ebre's scholarship illustrates a sort of hybrid approach to the text that reflects some of the distinction between early imprints and late imprints. Now, while early imprints can be difficult to trace, there are certain features that immediately give away an early impression date. As Guo Lixuan has noted, proof printing in Chinese is generally done in red or blue ink. These colored impressions were desirable by collectors, and early versions often have notes from a later collector. So the Harvard Yanjing edition of this Guangxi Tongzhi, there's a copy upstairs. I should have pulled it out and seen the one here at University of Chicago looks like, is an example of a blue imprint. This is a Jiajing, really early copy that Shenjin has called an early copy. And there are a couple of other ways you identify an early copy. So this doesn't look very blue because the vegetable dyes in it have faded out, giving it a sort of gray quality. But the fact that it's on a bast paper, a pichu, is also a sign of a higher quality of text. So when you use a BAS, so paper mulberry, base paper in Chinese printing, especially in the Jiajing period where bamboo papers are more common, this is usually a sign of an early copy that was an author's presentation copy. And that's a whole different discussion. But this is an example of how you build evidentiary basis around text to say, okay, this is an early edition. You have a clear imprint, maybe you have some blue, you have higher quality paper. Those are diagnostic features you can use to help you start placing your book, the copy you're looking at, within a networked relationship of other copies you've examined. Now, later impressions from blocks tend to reveal themselves quite readily. The blocks are often damaged. The damage is generally not from the act of printing, however. And I think this is really important. People think that blocks wear out from overprinting. No printer in China I have ever talked to has talked about the end life of their blocks from the act of printing. Rather, as the blocks are stored, they shrink, they warp, they crack, and when occasionally put to use, they're damaged by accidents, as I witnessed in Sichuan. So a set of blocks held at UCLA demonstrates patterns of wear from improper storage. So here's a great example of just these lines are completely worn out. This is the preface. Here are plugs that are still in like bold relief. And so however this was stored in whatever storage facility for these blocks, there was some sort of pattern of environmental damage that basically chewed up the first two blocks of the preface, because the rest of the book just looks like this. High quality, very solid blocks from the late Qianlong reign. And so it's that is usually, I would hypothesize, the reason blocks wear out. Now, if we're talking about like Fujian Mashaben or like popular literature, I think it's probably possible around 20, 30,000 copies of a book, the blocks are starting to wear out. But, you know, absent evidence, I'm now just saying blocks wear out from storage over time, because that seems to be the most likely case. So while damage patterns in blocks are really important for us as bibliographers and users of Chinese books to identify superstates, as Ibri has done, other factors also allow us to identify when a book is a later imprint. Which is cheaper paper, and also the expansion of paratextual elements. Preface 1, Preface 2, Preface 3. The longer a book sits around, the more buds come by and write prefaces, and then you just get one or two new blocks engraved. And that helps you to at least start tracking the evolution of the book. So a new preface is always a good sign that you're dealing with a Houyin. In the case of some of the late Ming books I've looked at, this could help us just differentiate between 2 or 3 years of the blocks existing. Now, the next to consider are these original blocks, the yuanban, and the amended blocks, xiuban. So that's when the same blocks are used, and the original blocks have to be altered and repaired. We only have the matter of order of printing from early to late. So right, he's Li Zhiqing here saying, you do your chuyin and your houyin, and then you find places where blocks are repaired, and this helps you start ordering your books. Now, the reasons we encounter xiuban are almost too many to properly narrate. So, for example, over time, taboo characters and blocks could be altered. As blocks change from one set of owners to another, the name of the printer could be removed and a new plug inserted with a new printer's name. Finally, and perhaps most interestingly, entire blocks could be replaced as needed, creating sometimes a type of book called a dixiuban, a successively repaired edition, or sometimes they're called the sanqiaoban. I forgot that upstairs. Well, some of you will see one tomorrow. Which, for example, in these guozijian, so these academy editions, the Nanjing Academy, they include blocks from the Song Yuan and then the Ming and eventually the Qing, all in the same editions of the standard history. So here we have the Song Shi. And one fun feature of these blocks is in the Hanlin Academy, or the Guozi Jian, they actually date the blocks in the later period. So here we have a Wanli 39 block. The Song and Yuan blocks are never dated, but from Jiajing on, blocks are dated, and they continue being repaired and engraved up through the Kangxi reign. So every time you look at one of these volumes, you're basically holding a book that has, is it an edition from 1200 or 1600 or 1700? It's all of those things because it represents multiple edition histories. Now, also to search for amended blocks, when I first open a book, there are several things I look for that give me hints about the likelihood of a xiuban. A fairly consistent tell in late Ming books are uncarved portions of blocks. So whenever I see this in a book, I stop what I'm doing and I go look at as many available copies as I possibly can. A good example, this book right here, is it's the memorials left in the censorate from the August Ming, Huangming Liu Tai Zou Yi, which was first printed probably in 1605 according to its preface. And this is a collection of memorials to the throne that was allegedly made from the records of the censorate. It was specifically supposed to represent opinions that had been repressed because they had never been forwarded for imperial review. The problem with this text is that it exists in two different forms. Only one has two prefaces, both dated to 1605. This is the version photographically reproduced in the Sikutranshu Tsunmu. So that's obviously the black and white you see in this photo here. The edition at Harvard, on the other hand, has a third preface dated to 1607. This led Shunjin to conclude in his catalog of the Harvard collection that these were two editions from separate blocks. However, if we look at the text carefully, it gets a little bit more confusing. So in this image here on the right, you can see the sorts of things you look for when you're checking for similar blocks. So here's just a little hairline crack running through that's probably actually just like a knife stutter. Anytime there are line breaks, I always note them or try and take photos. And so, you know, the pattern, these are obviously just like the exact same blocks. That said, between 1605 and 1607, the text was reconceived. It went from being a finished text into a text that allowed for the inclusion of new material. The 1605 edition begins with a table of contents after the prefaces. This table of contents lists all the memorials as well as their classification through the various fascicles of the book. This means that the first version was envisioned as a finished product with a set number of memorials and fascicles. In the 1607 edition, see, I'm even using edition improperly, the work was given an independent table of contents linked, instead of each section having a table of contents, there was one master table of contents at the beginning of the book. And at the end, they left this uncarved and they included new memorials. So here's this section ending with this, sorry, blurry photo. But then they just thrown a new memorial in, they extend the pagination in the section. And if you look carefully at this, they've ruled through to include future memorials. So this book will just continue to grow as you include more memorials. Which makes sense, right? This is one of these Wanli factional pieces where it's like, oh, I forgot my buddy's request memorial, we're going to throw this one in. And so you can just keep adding those materials in. And it essentially becomes the same, it becomes a continuing extended, kind of like a memorial magazine that's been already anthologized. And, you know, we can talk about all of the interesting things about this in a moment. Now, finally, is the very famous issue of fan ke and fu ke, so pirated copies, copied engravings. You know, this is something that someone in this room knows much more about than me, so I'm not going to talk about pirating in the Ming Qing or any time in history. But Li Qingzhi has described carefully two types of fuke. The first type of fuke is the fuke in the strictest sense, the pretender. In English, we tend to talk about these as forgeries, produced to mirror as exactly as possible the original blocks. Often this was not the printer's intention. So in the Qing, when people are making Song editions, they're re-engraving, trying to copy exactly Song editions. They say explicitly that this is a copy. It's just later collectors rip out that publisher's preface, that signal that it was a copy, and then try and get rich by selling forged Song editions. So these are also occasionally called yinkebun. And identifying fuke takes a lot of work, especially for these Song forgeries. Now, related to fuke is the second category, which is the fanke. This is a term usually used for any sort of reprinting in general. And on the screen we have, for example, a Tokugawa fanke of the Jiezi Yuan Huazhuan, which is on the table here. And upstairs, I thought I was paging the Chinese editions of the book, and then it turned out to be the Japanese edition. So this is an example of a fanke that had just been improperly cataloged. Sometimes these are also very hard to recognize. Now, this is also one of the most exciting things of working in transnational East Asian print history, which is all of the very many Tokugawa copies and re-engravings of Chinese editions. Sometimes they're very close and mirror exactly the original edition. Sometimes they sort of break the mold. I'll talk about that in a second. So here, for example, is a relationship between a Fengmenglong pamphlet, you could say, printed in early 1646, the Zhongxing Weilue, that made it to Japan rather quickly after 1646. And by 1648, Japanese carvers made a new, sort of full-sized edition of the work. And a comparison of the Japanese text next to the Ming text shows how a pamphlet, when enlarged and given standard formatting, becomes a sort of heavy book. And so here, Fengmenglong is obviously engaged in a political moment in 1646 in Nanjing, printing this book, that in Japan becomes a monument to Sinology. Just a little note on that Fengmenglong pamphlet, because it's so friggin' weird. And also, as you can see, these are not actually the same engravings. So this is just some blocks the printer of this pamphlet had sitting around for this dadakao, or text, that he just appended to then the back of this pamphlet collection on the Manchu invasion. And so, if you're looking at these sorts of things and seeing this also break in engraving style within a single book, that's another thing that, stop what you're doing, think about the relationship between texts. And this is really, really easy to take for granted. So other fanke can be more subtle, and UCLA's, again, this Diamond Sutra and Heart Sutra, with an appended illustrated explanation of miraculous response. We have all of the blocks for that at UCLA. May be a fanke, or it could be the yuanke. I don't know what the relationships between the blocks at UCLA are. And this copy in the Putong section of the National Library of China. So overall, the illustrations are the only way to identify differences between these editions. So I looked at the characters a lot, but really it's just the cobbles in the wall that finally, after staring at this thing through the text, I was like, oh, it's these little details in the back. You can see the cobblestone wall is detailed here. All of the detail is lost in this image. And especially for the 19th century, and especially for religious texts, trying to work out, is it a pirated copy because these are not sold for profit? What's the first edition? What's the yuanke? And then where are all the fanke? There's so much work that needs to be done for anything in terms of popular literature establishing those relationships that it's almost dizzying to contemplate. Lastly, also because at UCLA we don't have the book, we just have the blocks, it's bibliographically unknown really how to date it. So we'd have to do a carbon dating to figure out what this book is doing. So needless to say, how you approach a Chinese edition and a European edition is necessarily different. Now, the points of today's talk are not grand or counterintuitive. A comparison between how Western bibliographers understand the concept of edition and how related concepts have developed in Chinese bibliography reveals many, many more differences than similarities. The temporally defined production of a book in the West on the hand press bears almost no similarities to the complicated lives of woodblocks. But at the end of the day, you may be wondering, why does a comparative conversation matter? Now, we're not going to talk about that. The problem associated with edition transcends print traditions. Recent scholarship by economic historians has taken a comprehensive approach to analyzing some of the factors which led to the rise of European print culture and, of course, the teleological assumptions behind that. And they're charting the rise of the West, manuscripts and printed books in Europe, a long-term perspective from the 6th through 18th centuries. Elto Bring and Jan Luiten van Zuyden analyzed the increasing number of editions to demonstrate the role of the printed book in fostering the cultural conditions that created Western economic dominance. At the center of their argument is a comparison with China, which they assert had a relatively limited number of editions printed per year. Now, this has further extended into the work of another scholar, Louis Angelis, who's compared the cost of printing per unit. And he discovered that Chinese books were actually cheaper, really, per unit to print, even including the cost of engraving, especially after a print run passed around 500 books. So as he noted, the cost of producing books in China was not very different from that of Europe. He then concludes, therefore, could not be responsible for much of the observed difference in number of editions. The desire to compare the number of editions is understandable, but not rooted in any understanding of the nature of Chinese printed texts. Engraving a copy of the 4 books was a financial choice that lasted 4 generations with proper care. While we haven't really discussed print runs, we can't discuss them because it could be anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 individual copies printed over 100, 200, 300 years. More importantly, however, and I think you now all see, the damage of this improper analogy of edition is rooted in something far more pernicious, which are myths of Western superiority. And perhaps even more worrying is a recent scholar comparing bibliographical traditions of the West and China noted that Chinese bibliographers never seem interested in materiality. Now, the reasons for this should now be evident. Many aspects of materiality tell us nothing about the age of blocks or the initial printing. It is not really bibliographically useful to center materiality, which is why people in the Qing who are connoisseurs never cared about paper. Thank you.